My name is Tyrone Jackson. I am 64 years old. I am a retired logistics manager from Chicago, a man who spent his entire life working double shifts, sacrificing my back and my sleep so my family would never know the meaning of the word struggle. I thought I had built a safe fortress for my blood. But I learned the hard way that evil does not always wait for you in a dark alley. Sometimes it wears a designer dress, pours expensive wine, and sits right at the head of your own dining table. My son smiled as he carved the roast that Sunday evening, pretending our family was living the American dream. Then my 8-year-old grandson reached for his glass. His sleeve slipped down his arm. I saw the dark, undeniable shapes of adult fingers bruised into his tender skin. When he caught my eye, he froze, looked at his mother with absolute terror, and whispered, "Please do not tell Mom." I did not shout. I did not flip the heavy oak table. I simply smiled, excused myself before the dessert was served, locked myself in the guest bathroom, and dialed 911 in secret. If you are listening to this, take a deep breath. Because what I am about to tell you will test your faith in the people you think you know. It was supposed to be a normal Sunday dinner at my son David's house. David is my pride and joy. After my beautiful wife Shirley passed away 5 years ago from a brutal battle with breast cancer, David and my grandson Leo became my entire world. Shirley and I had worked our fingers to the bone our whole lives. She was a postal worker, and I managed freight warehouses. We saved every spare dime, and before Shirley took her last breath, she made sure we set up a substantial trust fund for Leo. It was a Loctite financial safety net meant to guarantee that our grandson would go to college, buy a house, and never have to scrape by the way we did. I loved David, and I loved Leo with a fierceness that only a grandfather knows. David had married a woman named Sarah. She was a white American woman from an incredibly wealthy, highly influential family out in the upscale suburbs. The Hayes family was local royalty. They had generational wealth country club memberships and political connections that ran deep into the state capitol. Her brother Bradley Hayes was the local prosecutor, a ruthless, ambitious man who was known for crushing his opponents in the courtroom and burying anyone who got in his family's way. I never felt entirely comfortable around Sarah or her family. They always looked at me with a polite, tight-lipped smile that felt more like a judgment than a greeting. But David loved her. At least that is what I told myself. When I pulled my sturdy 10-year-old sedan into their massive manicured driveway that Sunday, my chest felt heavy. I had been noticing a shift in David for the past year. My son used to be a vibrant, confident young man who filled the room with his laughter. He played college basketball. He walked with his head held high. But lately, every time I saw him, he looked completely drained. He had dark circles under his eyes. His shoulders were always slumped. He looked like a man carrying an invisible boulder on his back. When David opened the front door to let me in, he offered a weak, exhausted smile. "Hey, Dad," he said, barely making eye contact. He looked over his shoulder nervously before stepping aside. "Sarah is in the kitchen. Dinner is almost ready." I stepped into the grand foyer holding a small toy truck I had bought for Leo. The house was spotless, cold, and quiet. There was no warmth in it, no smell of soul food or the sound of old-school Motown playing in the background like in the house Shirley and I built. It felt like a museum where you were not allowed to touch the exhibits. Sarah walked out of the kitchen wiping her hands on a pristine linen towel. She wore a perfectly pressed dress and that same cold, calculating smile. "Tyrone, you are exactly on time," she said. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "Go sit in the dining room. David, do not just stand there. Take your father's coat and go check on the roast. You always overcook the meat when you do not pay attention." "Yes, Sarah," David replied immediately. His voice was completely flat, submissive. He took my coat, and rushed toward the kitchen like an obedient servant. My stomach tied itself into a knot. I hated the way she spoke to him. I hated the way my strong, intelligent son shrank himself down to avoid her wrath. But I bit my tongue. I did not want to cause trouble in their home. I just wanted to see my grandson. Leo came walking down the grand staircase a moment later. He was wearing a stiff button-down shirt and slacks, looking too formal for an 8-year-old on a Sunday evening. Usually Leo would run down the stairs and jump into my arms, yelling for his grandpa. But today, he walked slowly, keeping his eyes glued to the floor. "Hey there, little man," I said, kneeling down with a wide smile, holding out the toy truck. "Grandpa brought you something." Leo looked at the toy, then darted his eyes toward the kitchen, where he could hear Sarah snapping at David about the silverware. He took the truck with a trembling hand. "Thank you, Grandpa," he whispered, barely moving his lips. Something was incredibly wrong. The boy lacked his usual spark. He looked pale, anxious, and deeply terrified of making the slightest noise. We moved to the dining room and took our seats around the massive, heavy oak table. The tension in the room was so thick you could choke on it. Sarah directed every single aspect of the meal. She dictated where I should sit, how David should carve the meat, and what Leo was allowed to put on his plate. David stood at the head of the table, carving the roast with shaking hands. He accidentally dropped a small piece of meat onto the immaculate white tablecloth. "David, really?" Sarah snapped, slamming her fork down on the table. "Are you entirely incapable of doing one simple task without making a mess? You are acting like a clumsy child. Clean that up immediately." "I am sorry, Sarah." David mumbled, his face flushing red with deep humiliation. He quickly grabbed a napkin and scrubbed at the tiny spot, completely avoiding my gaze. I gripped my napkin under the table, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to stand up and demand she speak to my son with respect. But I am a logistical man. I observe the whole board before I make a move. I kept my mouth shut and watched. Leo sat next to me, picking at his green beans. He had not said a word the entire dinner. He just kept his head down, trying to be invisible. "Leo, sit up straight," Sarah commanded without even looking at him. "You are slouching like a peasant. Eat your food properly." Leo flinched violently at the sound of her voice. "Yes, ma'am," he squeaked, straightening his small back. I tried to lighten the mood. "So, Leo, how is school going, buddy? Are you still playing soccer with your friends at recess?" Leo swallowed hard and kept his eyes on his plate. "It is okay, Grandpa. I do not play soccer much anymore." "Why not?" I asked gently, trying to catch his eye. Before Leo could answer, Sarah cut in. "Because soccer is a chaotic, dirty sport, Tyrone. Leo needs to focus on his academic tutoring and piano lessons. We do not have time for him to be running around in the mud getting injured. My brother Bradley is already setting up interviews for Leo to get into the prestigious prep academy next year. We are securing his future." I forced a polite nod, though my blood was boiling. I looked back at Leo. The boy looked completely defeated. He reached across the table to grab a warm dinner roll from the basket. As he stretched his arm out, the cuff of his stiff, long-sleeved shirt rode up past his wrist. My heart stopped dead in my chest. Right there on my grandson's forearm were dark, purplish, black bruises. They were not the kind of bruises a boy gets from falling off a bicycle or bumping into a door. I have lived a long life. I have seen violence. I knew exactly what those marks were. They were the distinct, unmistakable shapes of adult fingers. Someone had grabbed his small arm with terrifying, vicious force. The air was sucked completely out of the room. My vision tunneled, focusing entirely on those dark marks on his tender skin. I felt a cold, primal rage ignite in the very center of my soul. This was my blood. This was the boy Shirley and I had sworn to protect and provide for. Leo noticed me staring. He quickly yanked his arm back, pulling the sleeve down to his knuckles, his breathing hitching in his throat. I leaned in close to him, keeping my voice incredibly soft, so Sarah, who was busy scolding David about the wine glasses, would not hear. "Leo, buddy," I whispered, pointing with my eyes at his arm. "Where did you get those marks on your arm? Did somebody hurt you?" Leo's eyes widened to the size of saucers. Absolute paralyzing terror washed over his young face. He shrank back into his chair, his body trembling uncontrollably. He looked frantically at his mother, then back at me. Tears welled up in his bright eyes. "Grandpa, please," he whispered, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Please do not tell Mom, please." That single plea shattered my heart into a million jagged pieces. "Please do not tell Mom." He did not say, "Do not tell Dad." He did not say he fell. He begged me not to tell the woman sitting across from us. The implication was horrific and clear. Sarah was the monster putting her hands on my grandson. And David, my strong, beautiful son, was too broken and terrified to stop her. My mind raced at 1,000 miles an hour. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leap across the table to grab Sarah by her designer collar and drag her out of the house. I wanted to roar. I wanted to take my son and my grandson, put them in my car, and drive far away from this toxic prison. But I am 64 years old, and I have learned how the world works. I looked at Sarah casually, sipping her expensive wine, completely secure in her arrogance. If I caused a scene right now, she would immediately play the victim. She would call the police. And who would the police listen to? The wealthy, connected white woman whose brother is the ruthless county prosecutor, or the angry, aging black man yelling in her dining room? I knew exactly how that script would end. Bradley Hayes would use his power to have me arrested for assault or trespassing. They would slap a restraining order on me, and I would never see David or Leo again. I would be locked out, and my grandson would be left entirely at the mercy of his abuser. I could not let anger make me stupid. I had to be colder and smarter than they were. I took a deep, silent breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I let a gentle, calm smile spread across my face. I patted Leo on the knee under the table to let him know he was safe. "Everything is perfectly fine, Sarah," I said aloud, making sure my tone was completely relaxed. "This roast looks absolutely magnificent. You really outdid yourself today." Sarah smirked, pleased with the compliment. "Thank you, Tyrone. I always ensure things are done to a certain standard in my home." I wiped my mouth with the linen napkin and stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. "If you will excuse me for just a moment," I said politely. "I need to use the restroom before we serve the dessert. I will be right back." David gave me a quick, nervous nod. Sarah simply waved her hand dismissively and went back to picking at her salad. I walked out of the dining room, keeping my pace steady and unhurried. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway and stepped into the luxurious guest bathroom. I closed the heavy wooden door behind me and turned the brass lock until it clicked. The moment the door was locked, the polite smile vanished from my face. I leaned over the marble sink, gripping the edges so hard my hands ached. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were burning wet with tears of rage and profound sorrow. I thought about my late wife, Shirley. I thought about how she held Leo as a baby, dreaming of his bright future. And now that baby was sitting in a dining room, covered in bruises, begging for his life in a house of horrors. I turned on the faucet, letting the water run loudly to mask the sound of my voice. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. My hands were shaking, but my resolve was absolute steel. I was not going to let this woman destroy my family. I was not going to let her influential brother sweep this under the rug. I was going to blow their perfect, wealthy facade wide open. I pressed the digits. 9, 1, 1. I brought the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone ring over the sound of the running water. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher answered. My voice was a low, steady whisper. My name is Tyrone Jackson. I am currently at an address in the northern suburbs. I am calling to report a severe ongoing case of child abuse. My 8-year-old grandson has violent hand-shaped bruises all over his arms, and he is terrified for his life. The abuser is in the house right now. I need officers sent to this location immediately. I gave the dispatcher the exact address. I did not mention Sarah's name. I did not mention Bradley Hayes. I knew that if the local police heard the name Hayes, they might drag their feet or tip off the prosecutor before they even arrived. I just gave them the address and the horrifying facts. Please hurry, I whispered, staring fiercely into my own eyes in the mirror. I am not leaving this house without him. I hung up the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I splashed cold water on my face, washing away the tears and the visible anger. I grabbed a monogrammed towel, dried my face, and took one last deep breath. The pieces were on the board. The wheels of justice had been quietly set into motion. Now I just had to step back into the dining room, eat my dessert, and wait for the flashing lights to arrive. I unlocked the door and walked back down the hallway, ready to start a war that would bring their entire empire crashing down. I returned to the dining room and took my seat with quiet composure. Sarah was standing at the head of the table, slicing a complicated berry tart and laying each piece onto expensive china plates as if she were performing a delicate surgery. David sat rigidly in his chair. He was staring blankly at the floral tablecloth, completely shut down. Leo was doing the exact same thing, making himself as small as possible. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. I picked up my silver fork and took a bite of the dessert. It tasted like dry ash in my mouth. I chewed slowly, listening to the heavy ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Every single second that passed was a second closer to the moment this fake, perfect suburban world would shatter. I kept my face entirely blank. I had spent decades managing tough logistics crews in the bitter cold of Chicago. I knew exactly how to wear a mask when the situation required it. Suddenly, the grand bay windows of the dining room were washed in violently flashing red and blue lights. The bright colors bounced off the crystal wine glasses and the polished silver cutlery. Sarah gasped and dropped her cake server. It clattered loudly against the china. She stood up instantly, her neck craning to look out the window toward the manicured lawn. "Who on earth is parked in front of my house?" she demanded. Her voice was shrill and completely outraged that someone had dared to bring police sirens to her flawless, exclusive street. David did not move a single inch. He stopped breathing. His eyes darted to me, and I saw a flash of absolute paralyzing panic cross his face. He knew. Deep down in his gut, my son knew exactly what was happening. I stood up and wiped my mouth with my linen napkin. "I will go see who it is," I said calmly. I walked out of the dining room and headed straight for the heavy oak front door. Sarah marched right behind me, her expensive heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood floor. I opened the door and stepped back. 2 police officers were standing on the wide front porch. They looked young and completely unaware of the absolute hornet's nest they were about to step into. "Good evening," the older officer said, resting his hand casually on his belt. "We received a 911 call from this address regarding a serious child welfare concern. We need to come inside and speak to the homeowners." Sarah pushed past me, practically shoving me out of the doorway. "Excuse me," she snapped, her face turning red with indignation. "There must be some kind of ridiculous mistake. This is the Hayes residence." "Well, it is the Sterling residence now, but my family owns this entire estate. We absolutely did not call anyone." You have the wrong house. You can leave now." I stepped forward, keeping my hands visible and my voice incredibly steady. "There is no mistake, officers," I said clearly. "I am the one who made the call. My name is Tyrone Jackson. I am the grandfather of the 8-year-old boy inside. I have reason to believe my grandson is being subjected to severe physical abuse, and I need you to examine him right now." The officers looked at me, then looked at Sarah. The tension on the porch was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah turned her head and glared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Are you insane, Tyrone?" she hissed. "You invite yourself into my home for Sunday dinner and then call the police on me. Officers, this man is confused. He has no right to be doing this." "Ma'am, please step aside," the younger officer said, his tone turning serious. "If a call was made from this address, we are legally required to lay eyes on the child and confirm his safety. We need to come inside." Sarah reluctantly stepped back, her jaw clenched tight. The two officers walked into the grand foyer. David was standing at the entrance to the dining room, holding Leo by the hand. Leo was shaking like a leaf in the winter wind. He hid behind his father's leg, staring at the police officers with wide, terrified eyes. I looked at David silently, begging him to speak up, begging him to finally be the man I raised him to be and protect his son. But David just stared at the floor, absolutely paralyzed by fear. The older officer approached David and crouched down to be at eye level with Leo. "Hey there, buddy," the officer said gently. "What is your name?" Leo swallowed hard and looked up at his mother. Sarah was staring daggers at the boy, a silent, terrifying warning radiating from her eyes. "I am Leo," he whispered faintly. "Well, Leo," the officer continued, "your grandfather here is a little worried about you. He told us you might have some marks on your arms. Do you mind pulling up your sleeves for me so I can take a look?" Leo froze. He gripped his father's leg tighter and began to cry silently. David closed his eyes, unable to bear the sight, but he still did nothing to intervene. "He does not need to show you anything," Sarah intervened, marching over and putting a protective hand on Leo's shoulder. Her touch made the boy flinch. "He is a clumsy 8-year-old boy who plays hard. He falls down. That is what boys do. This entire situation is an absurd overreaction by a grandfather who does not know his boundaries." I stepped closer, keeping my voice utterly calm. "Just roll up the sleeve, officer," I said. "Just look at his right forearm. That is all I am asking." The officer reached out and gently took Leo's wrist. He slowly pushed the stiff fabric of the sleeve up toward the elbow. The dark, distinct shapes of adult fingerprints were painfully visible against the boy's light skin. The officer frowned, his demeanor immediately shifting from casual to highly suspicious. He stood up and looked directly at Sarah and David. "Those do not look like marks from a fall, folks," he said firmly. "Those look like grab marks. We are going to need to sit down and have a very serious conversation about how this happened." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, the heavy front door swung open. A sleek black luxury sports car had just roared into the driveway, parking aggressively right behind the police cruisers. Brisk, confident footsteps echoed across the porch. It was Bradley Hayes, Sarah's brother, the local county prosecutor. He walked into the house like he owned the very air inside it. Bradley was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, looking immaculate, and carrying a bottle of expensive bourbon under his arm. He stopped in the middle of the foyer, taking in the scene. He looked at the police officers, he looked at his sister, he looked at David, and finally he looked at me. A cold, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He assessed the entire battlefield in less than 3 seconds and immediately went to work. Bradley did not raise his voice. He did not have to. True power never needs to shout. Good evening, officers, Bradley said, stepping smoothly between the police and his sister. I am Bradley Hayes, the chief prosecutor for this county. I believe you gentlemen work out of the 4th Precinct, correct? I am very close friends with your captain. We play golf on Thursdays. The shift in the officers was immediate and sickening to watch. Their broad shoulders dropped. Their posture changed from authoritative to deeply deferential. They recognized the name instantly. They knew exactly who stood before them, and they knew his political weight in their town. Yes, sir, Mr. Hayes, the older officer said, suddenly looking very nervous and out of his depth. We got a call about a child welfare issue at this address. We are just doing our due diligence. We noticed some bruising on the boy's arm. Bradley let out a deep, sorrowful sigh. It was a masterful, terrifying performance. He looked at me with an expression of profound fake pity, then looked back at the officers. I am so terribly sorry you were dragged out here on a Sunday evening, gentlemen, Bradley said softly, playing the role of the burdened family patriarch. This is a deeply private and painful family tragedy. My brother-in-law's father, Mr. Jackson here, has been struggling terribly since his wife passed away. Recently, he has been exhibiting severe signs of early-onset dementia. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Dementia. I stood there completely stunned by the sheer audacity and speed of the lie. Bradley did not miss a single beat. He continued spinning his toxic web, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. It is breaking our hearts, truly. He gets very confused and horribly paranoid. He hallucinates things that are not there. He thinks everyone is out to hurt his family. My sister and I have been begging David to put him in a proper care facility, but it is hard to let go. Tonight, his paranoia just got out of hand. The bruises on Leo's arm are from a rough fall at piano practice yesterday. We already had our private family doctor look at it. That is an absolute lie, I said, my voice rising just a fraction before I caught myself. I looked at the officers. I do not have dementia. Look at the marks. Those are finger marks. He is lying to cover for his sister. Ask the boy. Just ask the boy what happened. But the game was already over. I could see it in the cops' eyes. They were looking at me not as a concerned grandfather, but as a confused, tragic old man. They looked at Bradley with ultimate respect. Sarah immediately chimed in, pulling out a tissue to dab at her dry eyes. It has been a nightmare, officers. He wanders around the house muttering to himself. He accused me of stealing his coat earlier. We just wanted to have a nice family dinner, and he completely lost his mind. I am so sorry for the trouble he has caused you. I looked at David. My son was staring at his shoes. David. I said, my voice breaking with genuine desperation. David, tell them the truth. Tell them what she does to him. Tell them what she does to you. Please, son. David slowly looked up. His eyes were completely hollow, defeated by years of psychological torment and the sheer power of the Hayes family. He looked at Bradley, who was staring back with a cold, terrifying warning in his eyes. Dad! David whispered, his voice trembling so badly it barely made a sound. Dad, please just go home. You are not well. You are confused. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. My own son, broken and terrified, playing along with the lie because he was too scared to fight back. The older police officer nodded sympathetically at Bradley. We understand, Mr. Hayes. It is a tough situation with the elderly. We will not take up any more of your evening. We will log this as a medical confusion incident and clear the call. Thank you for your service, gentlemen, Bradley said, shaking their hands firmly. Drive safe. The officers turned and walked out the front door, stepping back into their cruisers and driving away, taking my only hope of immediate justice with them. The front door clicked shut. The flashing lights disappeared from the windows. The house fell completely silent again. The fake pity vanished from Bradley's face instantly. He turned to me, his eyes burning with absolute malice. "You stupid, pathetic old man," Bradley sneered, taking a step toward me. "You actually thought you could walk into my town and call the police on my sister? You think anyone in this county is going to take the word of a retired warehouse worker over the chief prosecutor? I run this town, Tyrone. I own the judges and I own the police." I stood my ground, refusing to let him see me sweat. "I am not leaving without my grandson," I said firmly. Sarah laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "You are leaving right now, Tyrone, and you are never coming back." Bradley pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. "Let me make this very clear for you, old man. You are officially banned from this property. If you ever set foot on this driveway again, if you ever try to call my sister, or if you ever try to contact my nephew, I will personally see to it that you are arrested for criminal trespassing and harassment. I will bury you in so much legal red tape you will die in a county jail cell. Now get out of my house before I call those officers back and have you removed in handcuffs." I looked at Leo. He was crying silently, clutching his bruised arm, watching his grandfather being thrown out. I looked at David, who had turned his back to me, hiding his face in profound shame. I did not scream. I did not throw a punch, even though every muscle in my body wanted to tear Bradley apart. I knew that losing my temper would only give them the excuse they needed to lock me away forever. I straightened my jacket, looked Bradley dead in the eye, and nodded slowly. "I am leaving," I said, my voice quiet and dangerously calm. "But this is not over." I turned around, opened the heavy front door, and walked out into the cold night air. I climbed into my old sedan, gripped the steering wheel until my hands ached, and watched as the lights in the dining room flicked off. They thought they had won. They thought they had humiliated me and broken my spirit. They thought a corrupt local prosecutor and a wealthy zip code made them untouchable. But as I drove down that dark, winding suburban road, a relentless, burning determination settled deep into my bones. They had just cut me off from the two people I loved most in this world. They had forced me into exile. But they had drastically underestimated what a father is willing to do when his blood is on the line. I was going to find a way to tear their perfect, privileged lives apart piece by piece, no matter what it took. The war had just begun. The next 48 hours following that disastrous Sunday dinner were without a doubt the longest and most agonizing of my entire life. I sat alone in my small living room, watching the hands of the wall clock tick away the seconds, feeling a kind of suffocating helplessness I had not experienced since the day my beautiful Shirley passed away. Being formally banned from their property meant I was legally a trespasser if my tires even touched the edge of their pristine, manicured driveway. Bradley Hayes had made his warning crystal clear. A powerful, deeply connected white prosecutor threatening to lock up an old black man in his county jail is not an empty threat. It is a promise. I knew he would love nothing more than to see me paraded in handcuffs, stripped of my dignity, and thrown into a concrete cell, completely unable to protect my own blood. But Bradley Hayes made a monumental miscalculation. He did not know who he was dealing with. When he looked at me, he only saw a gray-haired retiree in a worn jacket. He did not see a man who spent 4 decades moving heavy freight through brutal Chicago blizzards. He did not see a man who managed thousands of moving parts, outsmarted catastrophic supply chain delays, and navigated the most unforgiving working conditions just to put food on the table. I was a master of logistics. In my line of work, when a major highway is blocked by a storm, you do not simply turn off the engine and surrender. You find an alternate route. You calculate the variables, you adapt to the terrain, and you reroute your payload until it reaches its destination safely. If I could not go to their heavily guarded suburban mansion, I had to catch my son in a place where Sarah and her influential brother had absolutely no jurisdiction. My grandson Leo attended an exclusive, highly secure private elementary school about 5 miles away from their gated community. I knew for a fact that David handled the morning drop-offs before he commuted to his accounting firm. That was my window of opportunity. I woke up at 4 in the morning on Tuesday, long before the sun even thought about rising. I drank a bitter cup of black coffee, grabbed my keys, and drove my old sedan toward the wealthy side of town. I parked 2 blocks away from the school, pulling under the thick shade of a massive oak tree. From this vantage point, I had a perfectly clear view of the school drop-off lane, but my car remained entirely swallowed by the morning shadows. The dawn air was biting, creeping through the vents of my vehicle and chilling my bones, but I did not turn on the heater. I needed the cold. I needed to stay incredibly sharp. For nearly 2 hours, I sat in absolute silence, watching a parade of luxury vehicles and sleek sports cars line up along the curb, dropping off children dressed in crisp, expensive uniforms. My heart hammered against my ribs with a heavy, anxious rhythm. Every time a gray vehicle turned the corner, my grip on the steering wheel tightened. Finally, just before the morning bell was scheduled to ring, I spotted David's familiar crossover pulling into the designated lane. I watched my precious grandson step out of the passenger side. Leo had his small shoulders hunched forward, carrying a backpack that looked far too heavy for a boy his age, walking with a timid, frightened posture that completely broke my heart. I waited patiently until Leo was safely inside the brick building and out of sight. As David pulled away from the curb and turned down a quiet, tree-lined side street to begin his commute, I shifted my car into drive and followed him. I kept a safe, calculated distance, tracking his vehicle until he approached a red light near a deserted municipal park. I knew this specific neighborhood very well. It was quiet, filled with old weeping willows and empty wooden benches far away from the prying eyes of the Hayes family network. As David slowed down for the light, I pressed my foot hard on the accelerator. I pulled my sedan directly in front of his crossover, cutting him off completely and forcing him to a sudden halt before the light could even turn green. David slammed on his brakes, his tires screeching sharply against the cold pavement. I threw my car into park, unbuckled my seatbelt, and walked with determined, heavy strides straight toward his driver's side window. David looked up, his exhausted eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated panic. He immediately reached for his cell phone, genuinely terrified that Sarah or Bradley might somehow be watching this unfold. "Roll down the window, David," I ordered, keeping my voice low, but projecting the absolute, immovable authority of a father who was not going to take no for an answer. "Dad, what in the world are you doing?" he stammered, his hands shaking violently on the steering wheel. "You cannot be here. You have to leave right now. If Sarah finds out you followed me, she will call Bradley. He will have you arrested just like he promised." I ignored his frantic rambling. I reached through the partially open window, bypassed his trembling hands, and unlocked the car door myself. I pulled the door wide open and looked down at my boy. This was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. This was the boy I had proudly watched walk across a college graduation stage. This was the boy who used to look at the world with boundless optimism. Now, staring up at me from the driver's seat, he looked like a broken prisoner of war. "Turn off the engine and step out of the car, son," I said softly, my voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. "We are going to take a short walk in this park, and you are going to tell me exactly what is happening inside that house." He hesitated, a fresh wave of tears brimming in his deeply sunken eyes. "I cannot, Dad. You simply do not understand what they will do to us. I grabbed him by the shoulder, my grip firm, warm, and entirely unyielding. I understand that my 8-year-old grandson has bruises on his arm, shaped exactly like an adult's fingers, I replied, staring directly into his soul. I understand that my incredibly smart, capable son is terrified of his own wife. I am your father, David. I carried you when you were too weak to walk, and I will carry you right now if I have to. Step out of the car. The sheer protective desperation in my voice finally managed to break through the thick, suffocating wall of fear that Sarah had systematically built around his mind. He let out a trembling breath, turned off the ignition, stepped out onto the quiet street, and followed me onto the paved walking path of the deserted park. The morning mist was still clinging to the damp grass. We walked in silence for a few minutes, before sitting down together on a cold wooden bench facing a small empty pond. For a long time, neither of us said a single word. I simply sat beside him, offering my presence, letting him gather the shattered, scattered pieces of his courage. When the dam finally broke, it was a torrential, devastating flood of absolute misery. David buried his face in his hands and wept. It was the deep, agonizing sobbing of a man who had been suffocating in silence for years. He told me everything. He confessed that the elegant, polite, socially refined woman he had married was a cruel, unrelenting monster behind closed doors. Sarah possessed a volatile, explosive temper, treating him and Leo as constant verbal punching bags to vent her daily frustrations. When David had initially tried to stand up for himself and establish boundaries, the emotional abuse quickly escalated into physical violence. She threw heavy objects, slapped him across the face, and berated him, relentlessly tearing down his confidence and his manhood, piece by piece, until there was nothing left inside him but blind obedience. Then the most horrific truth spilled from his trembling lips. Whenever Leo accidentally spilled a drink, struggled with his homework, or made a simple childish mistake, Sarah would turn her irrational rage directly onto the boy. The dark bruises I had seen at the dinner table were just the tip of a terrifying iceberg. She grabbed him, shoved him, and threatened to send him away to a military boarding school if he ever dared to cry or complain. "Why did you not pack your bags, grab your son, and leave the very minute she laid a hand on that boy?" I asked, my voice vibrating with a quiet, dangerous fury. "Why did you stay in that nightmare, David? You know your mother and I raised you better than this. You know I would have taken you both in a heartbeat." David looked up, his face stained with tears, his expression utterly stripped of hope. "I tried to leave Dad. 6 months ago, I finally gathered the courage. I packed a suitcase while she was out at her country club luncheon. I was going to bring Leo straight to your house and figure the rest out later, but Bradley found out." He paused, taking a ragged, painful breath, literally shaking as he spoke the prosecutor's name. "Bradley came to my accounting office the very next morning. He closed the door, sat at my desk, and handed me a thick manila folder. He told me that if I ever tried to take Leo away from his sister, he would utterly destroy my life. He showed me falsified financial records, Dad. Bradley had used his political connections to illegally access the internal servers at my firm. He completely manufactured a paper trail that made it look like I had been systematically embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from our largest corporate clients. He even created fake offshore bank accounts in my name to make the illusion perfect. He told me that the minute I filed for divorce or the minute I tried to call the police, he would press the button and have me arrested for grand larceny. He promised me I would spend 20 years in a federal penitentiary, and Sarah would be granted full, undisputed custody of Leo anyway. The absolute wickedness of the scheme hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. This was not just a toxic, failing marriage. This was an expertly coordinated, vicious hostage situation. The Hayes family had trapped my son in a gilded, terrifying cage, holding a fabricated felony over his head to ensure his absolute silence while they abused my grandson. David was completely paralyzed because any move he made to protect his child would result in losing his freedom, his career, and ultimately his son. I sat back against the wooden bench, letting the freezing morning air cool the raging fire burning in my chest. Bradley Hayes thought he was an untouchable mastermind. He thought his shiny badge, his tailored suits, and his corrupt local connections gave him the supreme power to play God with my family. But the arrogant prosecutor had made one critical, fatal mistake. He had left me on the outside. He had assumed an old retired black man from the city had no teeth left to bite with. He assumed I would just roll over and accept defeat. I placed my large, calloused hand firmly on the back of David's neck, squeezing just hard enough to ground him. "Look at me, son," I said, leaning in so my eyes locked directly onto his. "You are not going to prison, and Sarah is never going to put her hands on my grandson ever again. I am going to get you both out of that house, but we cannot fight a corrupt, entrenched local prosecutor with just our word. If we go to the local cops, Bradley will make the report vanish into thin air. We need irrefutable proof. We need evidence so undeniable, so completely damning, that all of his political friends run for the hills to save their own careers." I reached deep into my heavy coat pocket and pulled out a small, colorful plastic toy. It was a replica of a popular cartoon robot, exactly the kind of toy any 8-year-old boy would gladly leave sitting on a living room floor. But this one was entirely different. Over the last 2 days, instead of wallowing in despair, I had visited an old friend of mine from the warehouse district, a brilliant guy who specialized in security electronics and loss prevention. We had carefully cracked open the toy and heavily modified it. We installed a high-definition motion, activated hidden camera directly into the dark plastic chest plate, complete with a powerful wireless transmitter. "Take this," I instructed, pressing the modified toy firmly into David's trembling hands. "When you go home tonight, tell Sarah you bought it for Leo as an apology for my disruption at the dinner table. Make sure Leo leaves it sitting on the entertainment center in the main living room, where they like to have their evening drinks and run their mouths. The camera lens is perfectly disguised. It records both crystal-clear audio and high-definition video, and it beams the files directly to a secure encrypted cloud server that I set up." David stared down at the plastic toy robot, as if it were a live, ticking explosive. "Dad, if Bradley finds this camera, he will literally kill me. He will lock me away forever, and I will never see Leo again." "He is not going to find it," I assured him, my voice radiating an absolute infectious certainty. "You are just going to place it exactly where I told you, and you are going to act like the broken, defeated, compliant husband they expect you to be. Give them exactly what they want. Let them get comfortable. Let them feel powerful. Because arrogant, wicked people always slip up when they think they have already won the war." David clutched the toy tightly against his chest, holding it like a lifeline. A tiny, fragile glimmer of hope finally broke through the suffocating despair in his eyes. I nodded, patted his shoulder one last time, and stood up to walk back to my car. The game had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer just a grieving grandfather begging for scraps of time with my grandson. I was a tactician gathering heavy ammunition, preparing to wage an all-out war against an untouchable family. And I was not going to stop until their entire empire burned to the ground. The hardest part of setting a trap is the agonizing silence that follows once the bait is laid. After I left my son standing in that cold municipal park with the modified toy robot clutched to his chest, I drove my old sedan through the waking city streets with a mind running at absolute top speed. I knew the hidden camera would take at least a day or two to capture the undeniable proof we needed to expose Sarah. But my decades as a logistics manager had taught me one fundamental rule about dismantling a corrupt system. You never just attack the symptom. You must trace the rot all the way down to its foundational roots. And in a wealthy, powerful family like the Hayes dynasty, the root of every single evil action is always money. I thought about the sheer arrogance radiating from Bradley Hayes the night he threw me out of my son's home. A man like that does not risk his entire legal career and his prestigious reputation just to cover up his sister's domestic violence. He could have easily forced Sarah into quiet therapy or sent her away to a luxury rehabilitation center to protect the family name. Instead, he was actively terrorizing my son, fabricating federal embezzlement charges, and keeping David trapped in a house of horrors. That level of calculated extreme extortion required a much deeper motive. Bradley was protecting an asset. And the only asset my son brought to that marriage was the massive trust fund my late wife had established for our grandson. Shirley was a postal worker for 30 long years. She walked her route through the freezing Chicago winters and the blistering summer heat, her feet swelling and her joints aching with every single step. She never bought designer clothes. She never asked for expensive vacations. Every time she picked up an overtime shift, she deposited that extra money directly into a high-yield savings account. Before cancer stole her away from us, she transferred $500,000 into an ironclad trust fund for Leo. It was meant to be an untouchable fortress, legally structured, to guarantee that our grandson would never have to experience the financial struggles we endured. David was named the sole custodian of that account, with strict stipulations that the money could only be used for Leo's education and future real estate purchases. I needed to know exactly what was happening to Shirley's hard-earned money. But I could not just walk into a bank and ask for the ledger. I needed a professional who knew how to navigate the complicated, invisible rivers of high finance without setting off any alarms. I drove straight across town to a modest brick house in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. It was the home of Calvin Brooks. Calvin and I went way back to my warehouse days. He was a retired forensic accountant who used to audit massive corporate supply chains, a man who could find a missing dime in a blinding snowstorm. Calvin was sharp, fiercely loyal, and held a deep-seated hatred for wealthy executives who thought they could manipulate the system. When Calvin opened his front door, he took one look at my exhausted, stone-cold face and immediately stepped aside to let me in. He did not ask any pointless questions. He just led me down the hallway to his home office, a room packed wall to wall with filing cabinets, old ledgers, and 3 glowing computer monitors. I sat down in a worn leather chair and laid out the entire nightmare. I told him about the horrifying bruises on Leo's arm, the fabricated embezzlement charges Bradley was using to hold David hostage, and my deep nagging suspicion about my grandson's trust fund. Calvin poured us both a cup of bitter black coffee, cracked his knuckles, and sat down at his main keyboard. "Let us see what the golden boy of the prosecutor's office is hiding in his expensive closet," Calvin muttered, his fingers flying across the keys with practiced precision. Because David was technically the custodian of the trust, Calvin used a few of his old industry backdoors and a contact at the state registry to pull the public filing records for the account. It took him about 45 minutes of intense silent digging through complex digital firewalls. The only sound in the room was the heavy clicking of his keyboard and the low hum of the computer tower. I sat perfectly still, drinking my coffee, praying to God that my suspicions were just the paranoid ramblings of a fearful grandfather. But the universe rarely answers those kinds of prayers. Calvin suddenly stopped typing. He leaned close to the monitor, his brow furrowing into a deep, troubled frown. He took off his reading glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and let out a long, heavy sigh. "Tyrone," he said quietly, turning his chair to face me, "you need to brace yourself, brother. What I am looking at right now is going to make your blood boil." I stood up and walked over to stand behind his chair, staring at the bright screen. The digital ledger for Leo's trust fund was displayed in stark black and white numbers. The account, which Shirley had meticulously built up to over $500,000, currently held a remaining balance of less than $12,000. My breath caught in my throat. My chest tightened as if I had been struck by a physical blow. The money was gone. 30 years of my beautiful wife's blood, sweat, and absolute sacrifice had been completely wiped out. How did this happen? I demanded, my voice trembling with a terrifying, icy rage. David would never touch a single cent of that money. He knew what his mother went through to save it. It was locked. He was the only one authorized to manage it. Calvin pulled up a digitized PDF document from the archives and enlarged it on the screen. It was a formal legal petition for a transfer of custodianship filed and executed exactly 14 months ago. Bradley did not just help his sister empty the account, Calvin explained, pointing at the bottom of the document. He weaponized his law degree to steal it right out from under your son. Look at this. I stared at the paperwork. The document legally removed David as the sole trustee and transferred complete undisputed control of the $500,000 directly to Sarah. And right there on the final page was David's signature, supposedly consenting to the total handover of his son's financial future. But I am a father. I know my son's handwriting. I know the way he loops his letters and strikes his initials. The signature on that screen was a masterful, highly sophisticated forgery. It looked close enough to pass a casual inspection, but it was absolutely fraudulent. And right next to that fake signature was the official brightly colored stamp of a public notary. Let me guess, I whispered, leaning closer to the screen. The notary who verified this forged signature works directly for the prosecutor's office. Calvin did a quick search of the notary registration number and nodded grimly. You hit the nail right on the head, Tyrone. The notary is a paralegal on Bradley Hayes' personal payroll. Bradley orchestrated this entire document. He drafted the transfer, he had his own staff falsify the verification, and he essentially handed your wife's life savings over to his sister on a silver platter. The scope of their wickedness was almost impossible to fully comprehend. They were not just abusers. They were calculated white-collar criminals. But Sarah was a wealthy woman who spent her days at the country club. She did not need $500,000 to buy designer shoes. I needed to know exactly where my wife's money had gone. Track the outflows. Calvin, I instructed, placing my hands firmly on his desk to steady myself. Find out where they routed the cash once Sarah took control. Calvin nodded and brought up the transaction history. Over the last 14 months, massive continuous wire transfers had been bleeding the trust fund dry. $50,000 here, $75,000 there. Every single transaction was routed into a private corporate account registered to a limited liability company called Liberty Consulting Partners. Calvin opened a new browser tab and dove into the state business registry to unmask the owners of Liberty Consulting. A few moments later, a complex web of shell companies and corporate fronts appeared on the screen. It was a sophisticated financial maze designed to confuse any casual auditor, but Calvin was a predator in this environment. He tracked the corporate registration numbers, matched the tax identification codes, and finally broke through the final layer of anonymity. Liberty Consulting Partners was not a real business. It was a dark money political action committee. And the sole beneficiary of that committee was Bradley Hayes. The pieces of the puzzle violently snapped into place, revealing a picture so ugly and depraved it made my stomach turn. Bradley was quietly preparing to announce his candidacy for state attorney general in the upcoming election cycle. A statewide campaign required a massive overflowing war chest of untraceable funding. He needed liquid cash to pay for polling advertising and political favors. Instead of raising the money legitimately, he had conspired with Sarah to hijack my grandson's trust fund. They were actively draining black wealth stolen directly from the calloused hands of a dead postal worker to finance the political ascension of a corrupt, racist white prosecutor. This was the real reason Bradley had threatened David with fake embezzlement charges. It was never just about protecting Sarah from a divorce or keeping Leo in the house. It was about controlling the money. If David had packed his bags and filed for custody 6 months ago, the courts would have inevitably audited the trust fund as part of the financial separation. Bradley's massive multi-$100,000 felony fraud would have been instantly exposed. David was an accountant. He would have spotted the missing funds the minute he looked at a real bank statement. Bradley had to keep David completely terrified, utterly broken, and isolated from me because my son was the only person who could legally blow the whistle on the stolen inheritance. They had turned my son into a psychological prisoner to cover up a grand-scale political heist. A profound, terrifying silence filled Calvin's office. We both stared at the monitors, fully realizing the sheer magnitude of the criminal conspiracy we had just uncovered. This was no longer just a domestic dispute. This was a federal crime. Wire fraud, political corruption, forgery, and grand larceny, all committed by a sitting officer of the court. "We have him," Tyrone Calvin whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. "If we can get this paper trail into the right hands, Bradley Hayes is not just going to lose his job. He is going to federal prison for a very long time." I felt a fierce, burning surge of absolute triumph. The armor of the untouchable Hayes family had just cracked wide open. We had found the weapon we needed to destroy them. But in the world of modern finance and corrupt power, every action leaves a digital footprint. Suddenly, the screen on Calvin's right monitor flashed a bright warning red. A sharp, piercing alarm beeped loudly from his computer speakers. Calvin jumped back in his chair, his hands flying across the keyboard with frantic, desperate speed. "What is that?" I demanded, my heart slamming against my ribs. "What did you just do?" Calvin's face went completely pale. His eyes darted rapidly across the cascading lines of code appearing on the screen. He cursed under his breath, his voice tight with sudden, undeniable panic. "It is a digital tripwire," Tyrone Calvin said, slamming his fist on the desk. Bradley did not just steal the money. He put a highly sophisticated active tracking protocol on the original trust account file. The minute I bypassed the final security wall to pull the raw routing numbers, it triggered a silent alarm. "What does that mean?" I asked, stepping closer to the screen. "It means Bradley's personal banker just received an automated alert that an unauthorized user from an external IP address is currently digging through the fraudulent transaction history," Calvin explained frantically, typing commands to scrub his digital tracks and close the connection. "He is going to know someone is onto him. He is going to know that the fortress has been breached." The triumph I felt just a moment ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, immediate sense of extreme danger. Bradley Hayes was a ruthless, powerful man with everything to lose. He had already proven he was willing to destroy my son's life to protect his secrets. If he realized that someone was actively pulling the threads of his political money laundering scheme, he would not wait to be exposed. He would immediately launch a devastating preemptive strike to bury the threat. And right now I was the only person with the motive to look into that trust fund. "Shut it down, Calvin," I ordered, grabbing my coat from the back of the chair. "Wipe everything and shut it down right now. I have to go." I rushed out of his house and practically sprinted to my car. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking with a new, terrifying adrenaline. The war had just escalated from the shadows into the blinding light. I had the motive, I had the money trail, and I was waiting on the hidden camera to capture the abuse. But Bradley Hayes was no longer resting comfortably in his arrogance. The monster had just been awakened, and I knew with absolute certainty that his retaliation was going to be swift, brutal, and aimed directly at my throat. When I pulled my car away from Calvin's quiet street, the air inside the vehicle felt entirely different. It was heavy thick with the undeniable reality that the shadow war had just been dragged into the blinding daylight. 30 years of routing massive freight trucks through the worst, most unpredictable winter storms in Chicago gives a man a specific kind of sixth sense. You learn to feel a catastrophic disruption long before the dispatch radio even crackles. As I turned the corner onto my own familiar quiet residential block, that alarm bell in my gut began ringing with deafening volume. I immediately killed the engine and let the sedan coast silently to a halt a full block away from my property. The neighborhood was usually dead quiet on a Tuesday afternoon. Most folks were at work and the retirees were inside watching television. But today, the street was blocked. Parked directly in front of my driveway was a pristine white county utility vehicle flanked tightly by 2 local police cruisers. Their light bars were not flashing, but their presence was aggressively loud. I reached into the glove compartment and grabbed my heavy-duty binoculars. Keeping my head low behind the steering wheel, I brought the lenses up to my eyes. 2 uniformed police officers were standing on my front porch, knocking on my heavy wooden door with the kind of force that demands immediate compliance. Behind them stood a severe-looking woman in a sharp business suit, holding a thick metal clipboard. Standing next to her was a large, muscular man wearing medical scrubs and carrying a heavy canvas bag. My blood turned to absolute ice. I knew exactly what I was looking at. Bradley Hayes had not wasted a single fraction of a second. The exact moment that digital tripwire went off in Calvin's forensic accounting office, the corrupt local prosecutor knew someone was digging into his stolen campaign funds. He knew I was the only person with the motive to investigate my grandson's trust fund. But Bradley was a lawyer, and he was cunning. He could not just send the police to arrest me for checking a public financial registry. He needed to completely and permanently discredit me. He needed to silence the angry old black man who was threatening to expose his golden political future. He had weaponized adult protective services. I watched through the magnified glass as the woman with the clipboard cupped her hands and peered through my living room window. Bradley had used his massive judicial influence to file a fraudulent emergency petition for an involuntary psychiatric hold. He was executing the exact lie he had spun at Sunday dinner. He had convinced a local judge that I was suffering from severe violent dementia, claiming I posed an immediate and terrifying danger to myself and the surrounding community. In a county where his family practically owned the courthouse, obtaining a temporary medical detention order would take him less than 10 minutes. If those police officers put their hands on me, I would not be going to a standard jail cell where I could invoke my right to a lawyer or post bail. They would forcefully strap me to a medical gurney, sedate me with heavy mind-numbing chemical drugs, and lock me inside a state-run psychiatric ward for a minimum of 72 hours. Once I was locked behind those heavy steel doors, Bradley would easily use his power to extend the hold indefinitely. He would have a court-appointed doctor declare me legally incompetent. My word would mean absolutely nothing. I would be trapped in a medicated fog, and David and Leo would be left entirely at the mercy of their abusers. I was effectively a hunted fugitive in the very city I had lived in my entire life. The sheer suffocating injustice of it burned the back of my throat. I had worked back-breaking shifts for 40 years, paid my taxes, and minded my own business. Now, because I dared to stand up to a wealthy white family abusing my blood, I was being targeted for institutional erasure. But Bradley Hayes drastically underestimated the mind of a veteran logistics manager. When a massive multi-million-dollar supply chain collapses, you do not stand in the middle of the wreckage and panic. You immediately assess your physical inventory. You map out the geographical blind spots and you move your most valuable assets before the competition can even blink. I lowered the binoculars and quietly slipped out of the driver's side door. I could not go anywhere near my front porch, and my car was a sitting duck. I left the keys sitting right in the ignition, locked the doors manually, and walked away without looking back. I needed to move fast, stay entirely off the grid, and secure my emergency resources. I walked down the narrow, unpaved alleyway that ran behind my neighbors' houses, using the overgrown oak trees and tall wooden privacy fences as visual cover. My heart was pounding a heavy, frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my breathing remained perfectly steady. I slipped quietly through Mrs. Gable's backyard, carefully avoiding her motion sensor floodlights, and approached the rear boundary of my own property. I did not keep a pile of cash stuffed in a mattress like some paranoid criminal, but my late wife Shirley had grown up hard, and she had always insisted we keep a fully stocked emergency bag packed in the detached gardening shed at the back of our lot. We had lived through enough rough economic times and unexpected hospital visits to know that absolute disaster never makes a polite appointment. I unlocked the rusty padlock on the shed door, stepped into the dark, dusty space, and grabbed the heavy canvas duffel bag from the top wooden shelf. Inside the bag was $5,000 in untraceable cash, a prepaid cellular burner phone, a change of plain clothes, and notarized copies of my most vital identification documents. Suddenly I heard the heavy rhythmic crunch of police boots walking down the gravel path along the side of my house. The suspect is not answering the front door. A deep, authoritative voice shouted to someone closer to the street. His car is not in the driveway, but dispatch said the neighbors reported he rarely leaves the house at this time of day. The prosecutor wants this man found and secured before sundown. Do a full sweep of the perimeter and check the outbuildings. I held my breath, crouching down low behind a tall stack of old wooden shipping pallets. The bright, piercing beam of a police flashlight swept rapidly across the small frosted window of the gardening shed. They were hunting me with aggressive, terrifying urgency. The flashlight beam hesitated on the glass for a long, agonizing second before moving away toward the opposite side of the yard. The heavy footsteps crunched back toward the front porch. I did not wait for them to call for backup or secure a tighter perimeter. I slipped out the back door of the shed, hoisted my aging body over the rear chain-link fence, and melted directly into the dense, untamed woods that bordered the edge of our suburban subdivision. I walked for 3 grueling miles through the thick brush and thorny undergrowth. I ignored the sharp, radiating pain shooting through my 64-year-old knees. I ignored the cold sweat soaking through my cotton shirt. I kept my mind completely focused on the objective. I finally emerged on the other side of the woods, near a bustling commercial highway, successfully bypassing the local police cruisers that were currently circling my neighborhood. I dusted the dirt off my jacket, smoothed my expression into a mask of calm indifference, and flagged down a passing yellow taxi with cash in hand. I instructed the driver to take me to the far industrial side of the city, a rough, forgotten district characterized by rusted warehouses and cracking pavement. It was a place where the glittering, suffocating influence of the Hayes family held absolutely no power. I paid the taxi driver generously and walked 3 blocks down the cracked sidewalk to a decaying, neon-lit motel. It looked like a building that had not seen a fresh coat of paint or a building inspector since the early 1980s. It was exactly the kind of transient establishment that only asked for cash up front and did not care to look at a physical identification card. The tired clerk behind the scratched, bulletproof glass barely glanced up from his small television as I slid a crisp $100 bill through the metal slot. He grunted, tossed a heavy brass key onto the counter, and pointed a lazy finger toward the dimly lit exterior stairs at the back of the property. Room number 42 was small, oppressive, and smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. The floral bedspread was worn paper-thin, and the heavy blackout curtains were permanently drawn tight against the flickering orange streetlights outside. It was a miserable, suffocating little box. But right now, it